Hey there. Thanks for tuning into this month's episode of the Fraternus Forge podcast. My name is Matthew. I'm your host. This month's episode features Sawyer Small. Sawyer is a licensed music therapist in the state of Tennessee, and he's been a close friend for me for about the past 6 years since the time that I moved to Tennessee. I'm really excited to share this conversation with you. Sawyer brings a lot of depth in the counseling, music therapy, obviously, space, and just mental health and emotional health space, which is something that I think all of us need to be paying attention to. It's as important as physical health, if not more important in a lot of ways. We cover a lot of ground in this episode. We cover what trauma looks like for children during those developmental years and different impacts that it can have. But the core of our conversation really focuses on grief, what processing grief looks like, the impact that it can have on our mental and emotional health, and the different forms that it can take as well. It's not a one-size-fits-all equation, not by a long shot. And the standard model, as you'll see later in the episode, of the 5 stages of grief, don't really hold as true as some people might think that they do. It's not a linear process by any means. And since grief touches all of us in our lives in one form or another, I think having a framework for how we move through grief is really, really valuable and important. So, excited for you to hear this conversation, excited for us to jump in together. If you have any ideas for the future of this podcast, guests that we can have on, topics you want to hear us cover, you can send those to me directly at fraternusforge@gmail.com. Name of the podcast at gmail.com. Or if you just want to drop a note and say, hey, that works too. All right. Thanks for listening. Excited for you to hear this conversation. Let's jump into it.
Because one of the most important things is that therapeutic relationship with the client and counselor. That's where you get most of the benefit from the therapy process.
It's not the nice couch and the soothing lighting that they've set up.
That can help, but that kind of goes into the therapeutic relationship. You're setting the environment for the client, and that's kind of helping that relationship. All the techniques and stuff do have some benefit, but it comes down to the relationship. And so telehealth is effective. Distance counseling is effective. They have found, though, that people are more willing to trauma dump on it and kind of overwhelm themselves because, one, they're in a setting where they feel safe, like they're home, and maybe they're alone. And that's
a good point.
They have found that people are more willing to what we call trauma dump, and that's not necessarily always a bad thing, but for some people who don't know how to cope or don't have those skills to be able to calm themselves down, counselors have to be really aware of when that's happening and how to calm a person down.
And you're doing it remotely. As opposed to being in the same room as the person.
Yeah. And we also would then have to, even before the session starts, we have extra things to have to go over, such as where are you located in case of an emergency? If we get disconnected, how do we get reconnected in a different way? And we also, in the first session, or maybe even every session, make sure they hold up an ID so we know it's them. Are they in a safe place? So
is that common because I'm sure if someone has an underlying condition, like a heart, let's say a heart palpitation or something along those lines, or a pacemaker, or anxiety or something along those lines. Is it common because with counseling, you're exploring trauma, you're exploring, negative perceptions about ourselves and others and our relationship with God, and it can get into some pretty heavy stuff, and people are in an emotionally vulnerable and fragile state. Is that common in counseling sessions where going through that process can evoke and sort of push someone into this place where one of those underlying conditions is activated to the point where they might be at risk physically?
Yes, and I don't know, it's kind of complicated because we understand how trauma takes an effect on the body, and how if people have had trauma, especially early childhood trauma and experiences, their whole nervous system, and a lot of times even a lot of their cardiovascular system is wired a little differently. And so a lot of things that we see with health conditions hypertension, high blood pressure, any cardiarrhythmias, heart arrhythmias, we see there is a correlation between like early or adverse childhood experiences and a lot of these physical symptoms that happen later in life. One of the biggest studies of that was the adverse childhood experiences study done by Kaiser Permanente in like the 90s. And they showed a clear, even sometimes a dose effect of like, if you have 4 adverse childhood experiences, you are this times as much more likely to deal with substance misuse later on in life. Or have diabetes or be obese. They have all this data on that to show that your stress response system is totally thrown off, and so your ability to cope with things is out of whack from an early age. And so all of these experiences you get throughout childhood, adolescence, adulthood, which would maybe not phase certain people, would be overwhelming for another person. So even just like stubbing your toe, I mean, that's a very small thing, but like something like that could set someone over because their stress response is already chronically active.
Right.
It does throw off our stress response system when we don't have a safe place, we don't have enough time to feel that safety. Our sense of like deep safety is not there, and our nervous system is telling us that we are not safe even when we are in a safe situation. There are some good books that are out there that people can learn a little bit more about kind of early childhood experience and how it affects the body. One is a very popular one, The Body Keeps the Score.
I've heard of that book.
It's a very famous one. He does a pretty good job of providing some research and also some underlying things that he's learned as a psychiatrist about the body and the body-mind connection. But one I recently read, which I think I really liked even more, was The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog.
Okay. I feel like I've heard that title.
Yeah. That one's by Bruce Perry. He is also a psychiatrist, and he has a unique approach with his book of doing all case studies.
Okay.
And so the title of it, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, really was about a boy who was raised in a cage for a certain amount of time in his life. And he chronicles how they treated that and like how they tried to help that stress response system, and even that interpersonal connectiveness. Like when you don't get that physical and emotional connection with someone in those formative years, it can affect our relationship with others later on in life. So he kind of chronicled how they approached that situation. But he also approached how the fact that there are even more critical periods in our life where if we do have like safe and nurturing environments during those periods, sometimes that can lay a foundation to help us cope with these very traumatizing things, like being put in a cage. But then the reverse could be said. It could be someone who had a very bad first couple years experience, but the rest of their life they had nurturing environment. But you find that because of those first 2 years of neglect and abuse, even if it's unintentional neglect, can cause like this effect of where this person may then develop these disorders or have a personality disorder. And I mean, we're learning more about it. Neuroscience is blossoming to the point where we're starting to get more of that like brain imaging and understanding that. But even with a lot of this and a lot of the evidence we're finding, it still is not caught up with practices. And it's kind of like that lag effect of we have the research, but it's not being implemented quite yet due to a lot of factors that could be another podcast.
Yeah. This is fascinating. There are like so many threads that I want to pull on here. I know we're going to talk about grief at some point. Okay, so a child in those formative years can develop a neurological disorder if they're not given that affection, that connection, especially with like a parent figure. And I really like this idea of looking at case studies because I don't know about you, but when I'm reading something that's like an academic paper especially, it turns into and this was a statistically significant change of 0.23, and the conclusion drawn by the researchers was da-da-da, and it's this big flowery language versus using case studies sort of drives the point home on, because it's a narrative, and we're drawn to narratives. I'm curious to know, in that book, and in your experience, or what you've sort of learned in your time in the field, for someone who has that lasting, or that early childhood trauma, whether it's through deliberate or accidental neglect, is full recovery possible? Like, could they get that person to a point where they're functioning consistently at the level of like someone who didn't have that trauma? Is that possible? What does that look like? I have a guess what the answer might be, but I want to hear it from you.
I don't. It's like as a counselor, or like as a mental health professional, that's the hope. Is that realistic at this point? I don't know. Functioning to the point of someone who didn't have that experience, I guess I don't know if it'll ever get to that point. But what we want is to functioning to the point of optimal living for them.
That's a good point.
Because I mean, optimal living looks different for every person, and I would say it takes in a lot of factors of, they may not develop like people who have some of these traumatic experiences. Trauma is defined by them, of like, was it overwhelming for them? Because some people have so many support and protective factors that, like, even if they have these traumatic experiences that we would define as like a natural disaster or neglect, abuse, they can still not develop a psychological disorder. Trauma doesn't necessarily.
It doesn't have to happen.
It doesn't have to. It doesn't always result in a psychological disorder, but we find that the risk for developing is a lot higher for those who have had an early childhood experience. And so,
here's a question: when it comes like, is there a predictive model? Like, are there genetic sort of, I guess, temperamental differences or other factors that can make that more or less likely? Like, let's say that somebody is higher in conscientiousness. Does that make them more or less likely to, you know what I'm saying at? Like, see what I'm getting at?
I guess you're kind of talking about, like, intelligence is kind of one thing too. That can be a protective factor for people who are able to then be able to cognitively reframe things.
Oh, I'm in big trouble then. Okay.
That is a protective factor. Intelligence can be a protective factor. So those who have an intellectual disability, it's harder to have some of that abstract thinking that is maybe needed at times to work through some things. And so counselors have to be aware of, like, how concrete we need to be with our language when working with certain individuals who need that. Question, it was genetic, kind of like genetic aspects. It goes back into nature versus nurture. And I think what we find is that it's both, because there is some genetic factors of, like, bipolar, schizophrenia are genetic. Those can be passed down. As well as, like, autism can also be passed down. That's more of a neurological disorder, which can be passed down. And so those things do have a genetic component, but there is also environmental factors to consider. So there's another field which I'm not as knowledgeable in, and I think I know someone who actually studies this. So if she listened, she would probably wonder what I'm saying, but it's called epigenetics.
Okay.
It's essentially saying that, like, we have our genetic code, but sometimes some of those genes don't get turned on unless, like, put into a situation where, like, it kind of, the environment turns it on, such as, like, we may have that capacity or genetic capacity to have, like, an anxiety disorder or certain things like that. But, like, if I don't have the environment that is, like, triggering that, I may not end up developing that anxiety disorder, even though my mom or parents did. And so that's how we see how some disorders like anxiety disorders can be passed down through generations. Is that at some point one of our ancestors had a traumatizing experience, would activated this stress response, and they were more anxious, and then that potential for that genetics to get passed down is a little higher.
Say that again. Like, if that's kind of wild. So if someone, let's say like a grandparent or something along those lines, someone in your family tree has an experience that activates part of their genetic code, it is now more likely to pass that down. Like they're now more likely to pass that trait down to offspring.
I wouldn't say more likely. I would just say that like it activated, it turned on certain genes that may have not been like activated before. And like, since we do know that some things get passed down, like it just, the potential for it to get passed down, is there. Not saying it's more or less likely, but it's potential for it to come down. Because again, then once you have that child, and if you raise them in a safer environment, that environment helps so that they don't, develop that.
I see. Okay, so when we talk about passing, traits down, it's more from a nurture aspect as opposed to nature. Like you're not passing down genetic code. I mean,
both.
Yeah, actually, there is both. There is both. But what I guess what I was getting at is it sounded like a traumatic experience could in some way like alter somebody's genetic code or activate different parts of it, and after that happens, it makes it more likely that that trait is going to be passed down to the next generation. It's more likely from a genetic perspective. Is that
not entirely false? I mean,
not entirely. Wow.
Because we think about historical traumas of. I guess if you did some more research, and if I did some more research on like the Holocaust, and the amount of trauma that, especially the survivors of the Holocaust had, and like let's see, what their offspring and the next generations, are we seeing a higher prevalence of anxiety disorders then, or depressive disorders, or you name it?
Isn't that more from a nurture perspective though?
There's some nature aspects too then.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
that's crazy.
Because it really has altered into epigenetics. Like again, I'm not too knowledgeable on that.
Yeah.
But when you look more into epigenetics, that's what they're finding is that nature, the environment, can affect and almost like turn on certain genes that were inactive. And so, I mean, I'm probably giving like a very vague version of it, and I wish I could be more like articulate.
You're doing great. You're doing great. I'm going to be doing so many YouTube searches after this. So we've talked a little bit about like different forms of trauma and like the impact that those can have, especially during those formative years for a child. Let's talk about grief in particular. How does grief compare to other forms of trauma, like let's say neglect or abuse? How does it compare in like let's say those early stages for a child? And then we can go from there.
Yeah, well, a couple things. I think it's having to define what exactly is grief. It really is the state or like of I mean, you could add a lot of longing in it, but it's really just like dealing with the loss. And what is loss? What's very broad. So a lot of times when we say grief, we talk about death. And particularly that is like bereavement. But whenever I do groups with at the hospital, I have to recognize that not everyone has had like a death when I do these groups. And so I broaden it of what is loss. Because we can lose a lot of things. I mean, we think about very physical things like a house, our job, a car,
keys.
Like keys. Losing a person or losing a relationship, that can be grief too. I mean, the list can go on and on with the physical stuff, but we also have symbolic losses that people don't often talk about, of like loss of a sense of safety. People grieve their childhood or loss of innocence due to the trauma they had. So there's grief attached to that trauma. Loss can also be ambiguous too, where, let's say, someone, their spouse has a dementia, and so there's this, like, even though they're not dead yet, but they're deteriorating, their cognitive level is deteriorating, they're losing their sense of self. And the spouse is also maybe having periods where the spouse doesn't remember them. So they're grieving the loss of their spouse's, like, personality and, like, their relationship. But, like,
and it's almost like a foreshadowing of eventually what's coming.
Yeah, which can also be considered anticipatory grief.
That was in your book. I remember that phrase from your book.
Yeah. But ambiguous loss is also tied to, like, I think a good example would be like a prisoner of war, or someone, a child who goes missing. Do the parents remain hopeful that their loved one's going to come back, or do they start accepting that the person's gone? So it's this ambiguity of an uncertainty of, I'm grieving, but, like, I'm not, but I am. And so sometimes that's not talked about, or sometimes the person doesn't recognize that they are experiencing grief. Question I usually pose to a lot of the patients at the hospital when I talk about this is, if I lost a penny today, would I grieve over it? What do you think?
Probably not.
It depends.
Okay.
So a loss is a loss. It's something that we no longer have. But we have to consider the factors that go into it of, like, what was that connection I had with that person or thing?
Yeah.
So if that penny was my last penny, or if that penny was passed down through generations and meant a lot and had some significant story behind it, I'd have some emotions attached to that. Or if that was the first penny I ever made and was worth $1 million, I probably would have some reactions toward that.
Yeah.
And so I tell patients, like, I'm not trying to compare a penny to a life.
Right.
But this idea of, when we talk about grief, we talk about loss, we have to factor in the connection we have with that person or thing, and also the nature of the loss, like these factors that impact how we grieve. So I may lose one person in my life, like they may die, but it may not be as impactful as another person because of all these factors. And it doesn't necessarily negate the grief of one or the other. We're not trying to compare, but it does help me understand, how come I reacted this way during this loss, but not during this loss? And then you start to feel like, was I cold-hearted with that first person?
Yeah. I know what you're describing. Like, I remember having similar thoughts growing up, and, like, my parents would bring my brothers and I to funerals of different family members, like extended family members. And just for context, there's my family's kind of scattered all over the country, and so we don't see each other super often. And there's drama and, like, family history to go along with that.
Yeah.
But we would show up at these places, and, like, my mom or dad would know most of the people there, and so they'd be a little more impacted by it. And I would witness everything and just be, like, kind of hard on myself. Why am I not, like, crying more? Why is everybody else crying? Why is this hitting everybody more than me? Even when my grandmother on my mom's side passed, even when my grandfather on my mom's side passed, like, these are people that I had a personal relationship with and spent a good amount of time with growing up. Even then, I know it hit my mom really, really hard because those were her parents. But I remember feeling like, why am I not crying more? Like, this should hit me harder. This is someone who was close to home. Like, we lost my dad, actually, like a month and a half ago at the time of recording this episode. And that's been harder because he's been close. He's closer to me.
Right.
He's the closest person that I've ever lost. And even then, the initial stages, I was still hard on myself because I looked around at my family members and everybody was, like, crying a bunch. And not to say that I wasn't crying at all. I definitely, like, had my moments, but I remember thinking, like, why is this not hitting me harder? Did I not love this person? So just going back to your original point, I've experienced that.
Well, and that's a very common experience, though, too, because people compare their way of coping with a loss to other people. And so, like, the most important thing to say is the way that you grieve is the way that you grieve. Yeah. Because some people don't cry because anger is more present in the moment of just the whole, trying to understand cognitively what's happening.
Yep.
Intellectually, I understand this, but feeling-wise, I don't.
From an emotional perspective, yeah.
And so people may also be tied up with other emotions like guilt or just overwhelming numbness too. Like maybe it's just like your body's way or your mind's way of shutting down so you don't feel this amount of emotional pain is to become numb.
Mechanism. Sure.
Mm-hmm. Or then you're feeling all the emotions at once and you're overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. And so you're screaming and it's not necessarily tears coming out. It's just kind of like this general sense of pain. And we do know that like our brain registers physical pain and emotional pain similarly. And so it makes sense that people are sometimes incapacitated by grief or by all these intense emotions that come, especially right after the loss. And for some people, many years still, which gets into a different topic too of this debate over pathologizing grief.
Mythologizing?
Pathologizing, like putting like a diagnosis on it.
Okay.
That's kind of a debate right now because the newest diagnostic and statistical manual came out about like 3 months ago. I think 3 months ago. It was back in March, and it didn't really change too much. I mean, it's still the DSM-5, but they have a text revision now, and they added what they called prolonged grief disorder, which was kind of in the previous one in a different context. What they're trying to say is that like, grief is a normal experience in life. That is a normal reaction or normal state of being when you lose something that you're very connected to.
Sawyer's cat just hopped up on my lap, and I'm not sure what to do. Hi, Kitty. Hi, Kitty. Hi, Kitty. Just gonna put you down. All right.
Grief is it's viewed as a natural experience. Like we have this way of trying to cope and understand the reality of a loss, and this is what we go through, the state of grief. When it becomes to the point where you are still unable to perform like daily activities, like you're incapacitated and it's that overwhelming, that's when we start to look at what else is going on. And so that's how the whole pathological grief comes in, or like complicated grief comes in of, it's been X amount of, they usually do it by a year. Like it's been this long and you still aren't able to function, like go to work. Then it might require like, hey, getting counseling, getting therapy would be helpful. And I would argue that one of the reasons why it can get to that point is because there's a level of trauma involved with it. That it's not just grief you're dealing with, but it's also maybe traumatic elements of the loss that you're having a hard time coping with. And trauma is not a natural experience. And so I think when we have grief that lingers, well, not lingers, I should say when grief is complicating our way of living for that long, we might have to look at, what are some of the traumatic memories and things associated that are making this become something that you're not able to function.
That makes sense. So it's not just the loss itself, but there are certain aspects of like how the loss happened. Like if you lost a family member, God forbid, in a car crash or something like that, and you were there for it and saw it happen, or in the car, then that's a traumatic aspect of the loss that needs to be processed. Is complicated grief, I've seen maybe 1 or 2 YouTube videos on this, so stick with me. Is complicated grief like you lose one thing and then the experience of that loss is exacerbated by previous or related losses or other factors going on? Is that a fair statement?
That can play into it too, like multiple losses or like unresolved things from previous losses kind of get tied into your current experience. That can, I say, complicate the grief experience. And complicated grief was definitely a term they were using a lot more in previous DSMs. At one point, they call it pathological grief, which seems very like...
It's almost like a stigma.
Almost, And so then they started using this term complicated grief just to understand, more of like some people really, having a hard time functioning after certain losses.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're moving towards calling it prolonged grief disorder, which maybe is a little less the term itself is a little less stigmatizing. I mean, in my opinion, but I can't speak for everyone else. And so it's just really just saying that you've had grief that's been prolonged. And I'll say this, in my opinion, I don't think grief fully goes away. Like there's still aspects of you that are going to maybe, long for that thing that you lost, especially if it's like, I lost my mom. I'm not going to one day wake up and be like...
I was going to ask you, yeah.
I'm not going to one day wake up and be like, I'm glad that loss happened, or that like, I don't have any, feelings towards, the fact that she's gone. Like there's still going to be that connection I have with her. It's a different form now. Grief is obviously not incapacitating me at this point, but I wouldn't say that my grief is fully gone. And that gets into the whole like acceptance versus closure talk, which I think people confuse.
What's the difference? Yeah, what is the difference between those two?
How I would describe it is acceptance is really just coming to terms with the reality of the loss and the facts of the loss. So while some people think acceptance is like end goal for grief, that's not really the case. Sometimes it needs to be the first thing.
Sure.
Like we accept that the loss has happened in order for us to move past the denial. And we start to accept other aspects of the loss too, of like, okay, because I lost this person, I also lost X, Y, and Z, of like a person who did this for me, a person who did this for me. If we don't come to terms with some of the facts of the loss, we are living in this alternate reality. And that's where denial can come in, where we're denying that, anything's going on. We're not then allowing any emotions to come forward, because why should I be crying right now? Nothing happened. Or like, it's not that bad. So in my opinion, I view acceptance as more of like just coming to terms with the reality and not necessarily this end goal. And closure is what people think as an end goal too. Like, if I do this or this, I will be good.
Like I won't feel this anymore.
I won't feel this anymore.
Yeah.
And that can become a very unrealistic goal for a lot of losses, such as, if someone lost someone, like someone got murdered, and you feel like in order to get closure, that person has to get behind bars, or that person, you need to do revenge. You may find that, that not even that is going to, it's not going to bring the person back, and two, it's not going to magically make you
it's not going to give you the resolve.
Long for them again. But then again, that when we talk about murder, that's then also adding a traumatic element to it. So it's, when we talk about grief, we sometimes talk about trauma at the same time. So
gotcha. Okay. Yeah, so acceptance, and just playing this back, acceptance is coming to grips with what has actually happened. It's not an end goal, it's the initial stage that like lets you process through exactly what has happened.
Yeah.
And then closure is not, it's not like you cut yourself, not like accidentally cut yourself. And closure is not that wound healing to the point where it's like there's no scar, there's nothing there. People sometimes think of closure that way, but closure is getting to the point where it's like, you said this earlier, I am as good and as moved through this as I can be for me and for my
right
situation.
Now too.
Yeah.
I mean, even that analogy too of like cutting yourself is that depending on how deep the cut is, even if it closes, you may still have that scar. And so that's the emotional scar that still is there that you can see with grief. So like, I mean, that's where that whole analogy of like physical health and mental health come into play is sometimes closure is unrealistic for certain losses. And I think people think of closure as this magical thing that like, once I attain this, then I'm all good. Like I don't need, any help. I don't need therapy. I'll be all good. So I personally don't think closure is possible with, all losses, or even
it's not
any
even possible.
loss.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Well, I mean, what is closure?
Right. Okay.
I mean, I'd have to define that of like, if you think of a book, you close that chapter and you put it away, and with certain losses, especially like losing a parent, like I have and you have, like I don't want to just like put it on the shelf and never think about it again. I want to think about the person I've lost. I want to
and how
talk about them. I
Yeah.
want to remember all the good things too, and even, you know, even in the final moments too, like all those memories. What do they mean to me? What do they teach me? What can I learn from that?
Yeah, and how could you not? Because this person was a huge part of your life. How could you not think about them and not want to turn those pieces over? Like, something that I've noticed, and I'm curious to know what your experience in processing the loss of your mom has been like, but I think the first 2 weeks, because I was up in Michigan almost immediately after we lost my dad, and it was a whirlwind of cards and the funeral and people calling and helping my mom organize things. And that, I think I was running on adrenaline for most of it. Also trying to, like, there's this, I'm a huge Jordan Peterson fan, you know this, but there's a video of his where he talks about wanting to be the strongest person at your father's funeral is a good goal to set. Being the person that, like, people can count on as they're grieving. And so I feel like by golly, I'm gonna assume this mantle and help people. And maybe I neglected myself during that process, maybe not, who knows. But what I will say is that the 2 weeks following that, where I left Michigan and came back to Nashville, and it was my first week back at work, first week going to Bible study and other things again, those first couple of weeks were really hard because I think the underlying narrative was, okay, and now life is just supposed to continue. I remember taking a walk with my mom a couple of nights before I left, and we walked over the highway, and I was watching all of these cars just, you know, zip down I-75 for anyone who's from the Metro Detroit area. And I remember just being angry, like, would you stop? Like, would you idiots just stop driving your cars? Do you know what's happened? So, I don't know, like, does that resonate with you at all? Like, did you experience any of that?
Yeah. I mean, I was 14 at the time, and I think I was more of like, the way I coped was to involve myself in a lot of things, which I still kind of do, and I like maybe a residual effect of like productivity and just involving myself in things.
Sure.
But that really, I think, resonates a lot more with my sister, my oldest sister, who was in college at the time. I think she was a sophomore. She was a sophomore at the time, and with her, she had the experience of like, first when she was told that she should probably drive back to her hometown to go to the hospital, to Rochester, Minnesota, to see my mom, because my mom was going to the hospital for the last time, we thought. Her first thought was like, but I have an exam tomorrow. Like, this, you know, we're so ingrained into this like culture of like this to the next to the next to the next that like even she recognized in herself that like, oh my gosh, I can't even step back to like, you know, deal with this emotional stuff because
I'm so in
this. But she did come, and then when she got back, she had this feeling of like, well, now I have to go back to this exam. And it's like the world never stopped, even though my world stopped. And so she had to kind of wrestle with that because she felt guilty for like, her first thought was, but I have an exam tomorrow. She felt guilty for thinking that because, your mom is most likely going to die in the next day, and we're trying to make sure that you get there. And so I think she had to wrestle with that for a bit of like the anger of, the guilt of, you know, thinking that right away, like the automatic thought that came, which is not her fault. And two, the anger when she got back to college of like, wait, now I'm just supposed to like
just move on.
Go right back to this. And you find that in adult world too, with like, some people get bereavement days for work, but it's not much.
Right.
Some places will give you 1 day, some will give it 3, and then after those 3 days, you're magically able to work again.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I definitely, because I remember talking with my boss the Monday after it happened,
Mm-hmm.
and my company has a real like generous bereavement policy.
Mm-hmm.
Ours was 2 weeks, which was really, really nice and really generous of them.
Yeah.
But I feel like the implication, and it was never stated, and I don't even think that if you asked him or anybody at the company that they would expect this, but I think my mind concluded that, okay, 2 weeks sounds about like enough time to get through this and be a fully functioning human being again.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. And my brothers had less than that. They had something like, I don't know, 3 or 4 days, and then their bosses were like, get back to work, which I was like, how can you be this way?
Yeah.
It was kind of
and
nuts.
some employers will even do it where it's like it has to be an immediate family member. So if it's like a best friend, or if it's like someone who wasn't biologically your immediate family member but like raised you, that might be a little tricky situation of will they give you bereavement pay for it, or do you have to do your PTO or unpaid time off?
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good like angle that you brought into this, sharing what your sister went through upon like hearing the news of your mom's impending passing. And that's it's the hardest part about that's the book that you put together. It's a cool book. I really appreciated the multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
I like it when fiction books do that as well, but I also like it when biographies and nonfiction books do that as well, where you sort of get to see the same thing happening from multiple lenses.
Yeah.
I was really impressed by that.
When I was writing that, it was actually kind of my way of preparing for the 10-year anniversary, which was back in 2018.
I remember you working on that.
Yeah. And it was more of like a journaling experience for me, but because I wanted to give to my family to kind of like, what happened. But then as I was writing, and I did recognize, I'm like, I am telling a one-sided story, and I'm pouring out, my experience, but also at the same time, I don't know what their experience was. And now that I'm an adult and working in the mental health field, I'm like, I know there's more to this that I need to hear too. And so that's why I reached out to family to be like, if you're willing to, just provide, snippets here and there, I can pull together a chapter for you. I can, we can do this together. And one sister wrote a lot. Another one had a hard time being able to get in that space while she was taking care of her kids. And so we just did more of a FaceTime interview. One aunt was able to write a bunch as well by answering some of the questions that I had. And so it was great because I learned more about my family through that. And I knew there were certain stories that I wanted to go into the book as well. So I did kind of ask some of my family members of like, within your side, would you talk about this too? Because that's an aspect that I think might be important when writing a book. Because after a while, I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely wanting to publish this because I'm writing it in a way that's educational too. And so I wanted certain different aspects to be played into there, such as another one, my aunt lost her farm. And so like that's grief because she had so many memories with that, loved that farm. And my cousin's wedding was at that farm. And so there's a lot of like emotional attachment to a piece of land that like she was grieving, but we never put a name to it. And so that's another aspect I wanted to put in the book, or just different things that come up, like my sister and a lot of us talk about panic attacks and the anxiety that we experience. And so we started to see people's thoughts and emotions, or what they remember at that time. So it was interesting.
All of those different angles around the same loss, and I'm glad that you took a more narrative approach, because I feel like when we sort of talked about this earlier, this idea of like an academic paper, I feel like when you come at people with that level of information or that style of information, it's like you're appealing to just their brains and sort of like it's logic, and that's how people process it, versus if you present it to them and like their hearts are kind of closed off to that kind of thing, versus if you present a narrative to somebody, it sort of allows their heart to open up a little bit more, like, oh, this is a story, this is part of our, I guess, shared human condition. And I feel like that's really essential when it comes to processing and going through grief. And another thing that you said too that I thought was really beautiful, this idea of sharing stories around the process of losing this person. Like, you sort of see it from multiple angles, but then also your history with this person. I mentioned earlier that my family's kind of scattered all over the place. We don't see each other super often, but it really did bring us together, at least for like a short period of time. There was a funeral, and we saw folks from all over the place. Like, my dad's middle school locker partner showed up. Like, they reconnected after however many years. I saw so many grown men in tears over like my dad's, and in that process, we heard, and I heard so many different stories about my dad that I just had never heard before. Like, one that sticks out, there's so many good ones. Like, if we had like 2 hours, I would tell you a bunch of them. But one that stuck out was from my aunt, my dad's older sister. He was the baby in his family. I forget how many kids. His father remarried a couple of times, but the story she told I thought was really beautiful. When he was like 3 or 4, he used to go out into their yard, and the yard overlooked a freeway. There was flat piece of land, and then it sort of ran down to the freeway. And so he would sit like right where the flat part met the downhill. He would sit right there and just watch the cars for hours. And his mom would like bring him his lunch out there. And I just thought that was such a beautiful, because like my dad's always been like he was always like a very logic-oriented guy, very observant. It seemed like a really intellectual thing to do. Like, here he is, age 3 or 4, already studying automobiles. Like, look at these cars. This is so interesting. It was just cool. Like, and it's, I don't know. Like, what do you make of that? Like, why is that helpful in the grieving process, to tell stories about the person? Why is that a good thing?
Well, you're keeping a lasting connection with them. One thing, when we have like these memorial services or funerals, it gives a sense of people can have joy, people can have laughter in a time that people normally think is like, you're just sad. Let's all wear black. My mom had been quoted once saying, like, if I ever die, like, please don't wear black at my funeral. Like, please wear the most vibrant stuff. And someone did reach out to me, like, I think it was when I released the book, and then I was doing some concerts and book signings. One person came up and said, I remember your mom's funeral because I made sure to wear something colorful, because I remember Becky one time saying, like, I don't wear black. And so those stories, those moments, what we want to do with grief, especially when we lose a person, is to maintain that connection in a certain way, because grief is love in a different form. It's us still feeling that connection with them. And because that we can't, physically be with them, there is that longing. But part of the grief process is finding what that connection is. And so I think in memorials and funeral services, being able to talk about those stories helps you still get to know them as if they are still a part of your life. Not saying that they're physically still part of your life, but like emotionally and mentally, they are still a part of you, your experience, your past. And they can still be a part of your future in different ways. Like, if there were certain things that especially if you lost your parents or you lost someone, things that they taught you that you still keep with you. Like, if you still keep doing some of those things, you may find that like it gives you a chance to still remember them and still have them be with you in like a way that you want to. So if there's any like rituals that you do with your family that honor the person, those are some of the ways that we maintain that connection. And I think, and something I have talked about with patients before is sometimes, especially during holidays or like anniversaries, that can be a very tough time. And one of the things that can be helpful in those times is, instead of having this air of, do we talk, do we not talk about the missing person in the room, like giving a space to do it. So one example might be like, if it's Thanksgiving and the person that you lost normally brought the casserole, like, can someone else, try that, making that recipe? And granted, it's probably not going to ever be the same. Can someone take on the responsibility, or maybe alternate, someone always brings the casserole in honor of that person? Before you cut into it, you all share one story. Like, you're almost allowing everyone to have that space to talk about it instead of being taboo. Otherwise, everyone else is sitting in this like internal anxiety about like, do I bring it up? Do I not? Is it all right to?
Yeah, it's sort of like a signal that this is a space created specifically for this, because we're all thinking this on some level.
Yeah.
And it's going to come out probably anyway.
Yeah.
So better to be deliberate about it and make it more of a celebration. Did your family, so going back to something that you mentioned earlier, like in grieving the loss of your mother, I know you mentioned earlier that you initially sort of threw yourself into all of these different activities. Did you find later that practices like the one that you just described, where you create a dedicated space or sort of ritual to remember your mom by, were there things like that? Were there other practices that sort of helped you? Because I feel like we're kind of similar in that like we both like to be involved in a lot of different things. And I definitely have felt that being back here in town, like I need to write a book. I need to ride my bike across the U.S. or something. Like, I almost applied for this job in Toronto just recently, and I was like, I'm going to sell my houses. I'm going to get out of it. So what's that been like for you? What sort of, was that an avoiding mechanism for you? And how did you, if so, how did you transition to healthier ones?
I think the more that I've thought about it through the years, I lost an attachment figure at a pretty early age, and seeing as I was very close with her, I think instinctually I was trying to fill that gap of like that closeness to be close with others, and whether it's just being around people with activities to foster things that I like, so that I can like feel like I am continuing what my mom was passionate about. My mom was passionate about like she really encouraged me in my musical like endeavors, and so for me engaging in more musical stuff, I felt like I was still she was still with me in that sense, and so it was like it would help me maintain the connection with her and to think about her, but it also helped me to like involve myself with other people and to be around people and make those connections, because at that point it was, especially when I got into high school, that following like a couple months later after my mom died, it was just me and my dad, because both sisters were in college and my dad was always working, so I liked being active, so I wasn't really always at the house that much. Whereas now in adulthood I've kind of settled down a little bit, because I recognize that I can't go as hard as I used to, and
I hate that realization so much.
Well, yeah, as in like I put so much mental capacity into work that like I don't have that mental capacity for a lot of other things all the time, so I have to pick and choose my ability, and so I do value alone time now. Like I'm okay with alone time. So I don't know, I felt like there were ways I kept connection with her by being very social, like she was, involving in music, the thing that she fostered with me and was present with me all the time. But also there were always these like signs that I had of her, like we both love rainstorms, thunderstorms, so anytime that would happen, that would be like my moment with her. So I had that space to like actively think about her instead of avoiding thinking about her.
That's cool. And I like that there's something really beautiful about that, because a rainstorm is not something you can sit down and be like, there's going to be a rainstorm today and I will set this time aside. It just kind of happens. Like maybe you're looking at the weather forecast or something like that. So it's unscheduled, and it's ethereal, or not ethereal. It's on a natural level. Like something like rain, it's the movement of clouds, it's the water cycle, it's these powerful forces at work that you can't necessarily see at work, with the exception of like the actual rain falling. You don't have all of this comprehension sort of engaging your brain, and you sort of have to like maybe open your heart to that experience a little bit more. I like that a lot. There needs to be like a poem or something like that about that.
I went to this it was a conference / institute. So
Yeah.
it was about music therapy with adults and seniors.
Mm-hmm.
And
I was going to ask how music therapy plays into grief, if it does. But
yeah, I'll get into that.
Yeah.
Well, in this institute, it was led by someone who really pioneered getting music therapy into hospice and palliative care.
Yeah.
So dealing with a lot of grief and bereavement. And he has like these 4 institutes that you can do in order to get like a hospice and palliative care music therapy designation.
Sure.
And I went to the adults and seniors since I do a lot of that work. And one of the tasks that we had to do was first, as a get to know you thing, was to pair up with like 3 or 4 other people in this institute and to share our grief stories of like losses, and then to write a song all together about it.
Okay.
And we only ended up writing like a verse and a chorus.
Okay.
But what we latched onto, because we told each other stories, and what we latched onto was the rain. And how, like, people think that storms, you think I'm going through a rough patch, I'm going through a storm in my life. Like, that's a bad thing. And there are devastating aspects of storms. But at the same time, it can be cleansing. Like, it brings life to a lot of nature, a lot of plants, the earth. And so the title of it is Sweet Rain.
Okay.
And so after that institute, I then went home and actually finished. Like, I put some more verses, a bridge, and tied it all together in a sense. And I actually do use that song with patients.
Okay.
So in music therapy, a couple things I do with grief. I lead 2 groups a week on grief and loss. It used to be where people were able to elect to go into that group. That was pre-COVID. But our group programming, all that got changed through COVID. And so right now we're doing things by unit based. And so I have the topic of grief and loss, but I'm going into a group and not everyone necessarily is needing that. So I take the approach of, loss in general. And we talk about types of losses, emotions experienced with it, and then we explore, just the emotions associated with that and maybe how we move forward. Things I've done is I either, bring in a specific song that I have lyrics printed off for, and we talk about grief. I share the song, encourage them to read along with it, maybe circle or underline things that stick out to them. And we call that lyric analysis. And really it's just a chance for people to share their perspective of what they hear in the song or what the words mean to them. It's not about me trying to impose my thoughts about the song onto others. It's more of this is a very open, song that, it does talk about the topic of grief. So some people are going to get something out of it. I use the song Sweet Rain of mine. I don't put my name on it because it always makes for awkward,
I wrote this.
It's more of I tell people it was written by colleagues because it's not totally false. Yeah. I just don't want it to be about me, and I want it to be about the experience. But I feel like the song is perfect for the setting. And usually it's very imagery based, in which imagery and metaphors are a really great way to go about grief work because words are hard to come by, and so sometimes people describe their emotional experiences through imagery. And so Sweet Rain, that imagery of that people can talk about.
There's a contrast.
Yeah.
Like we were talking about.
Yeah. And then butterflies are also in the song, and that has a lot of imagery tied to grief because it is a symbol for grief for a lot of reasons. And I ask patients, I'm like, what do you think, the symbol of butterfly, why would that be associated with grief? And I always get different responses each time. And so exploring imagery, exploring metaphors through music is a great way to open up conversation and experiences. Another thing that I've done before too is actually bringing in instruments and doing more of a emotion-based improv experience to be able to express emotions through instruments. Whether that's having people play something on an instrument and having people guess what emotion they're trying to convey, which it makes for a great experience because sometimes even with real emotions, how we behaviorally present them, I may be experiencing anxiety, but it doesn't look like anxiety to you. You think I'm angry, but really it's from a place of anxiety that I'm feeling. And so we can kind of almost experientially showcase that in group through like the instruments of like, I'm playing something like that was anxiety. How did you not hear that I'm anxious?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, all I heard was just like banging, and I thought you were angry at me. Like it makes for some good, what we call perspective taking.
Yeah.
Of understanding that, we don't know what people are going through, and sometimes it is hard to explain, but like, here's how we can kind of try to communicate and get to know each other through it. I really like the imagery and metaphor aspects of grief work, because it's not me trying to teach. It's not me trying to tell you like a manual on how to get through grief. What I'm trying to do in groups is more of like help you understand your own grief and what might be some things that you can do to cope with the emotions, but also help you move forward. Not move on, like not forget, but like to move forward in your life and maintain that connection that you feel you need.
Yeah, that's something that I've heard a couple of times over the past month or so. As my whole family is processing this, it's been, we're not moving on, because moving on sort of implies like you're abandoning this person.
Yeah.
I had the thought earlier too when we were talking about sharing stories. I think another aspect of that is, and you may have already said this, just sort of playing it back in a different way, is like you're continuing to build that depth with that person, because essentially like a person is someone that you have shared experiences with, and then those shared experiences sort of make up this collage of your relationship. And the more experiences you have, the deeper those experiences are, the more colorful that collage, the more it means to you.
Yeah.
And so when that person leaves, on some level, it's like, well, we still have all of this room on this collage that we're supposed to be painting. You were supposed to help me finish this thing, or keep painting this thing. But then sharing those experiences with each other sort of helps you add color to that collage. And like it's a consolation in some regards after the person passes. Like other people are adding to this person's collage for you, and it's not the same as them being there painting with you, but there's something beautiful and healing about that. And then on this topic of imagery as well too, and we've said this like a couple of times in this conversation, it's like my mom got me a pillow, this little throw pillow, when I was like 8 or 9 years old. And at the time I was like, thanks, Mom. Like, I have Power Rangers and I'm going to be out in the yard. Thanks for the throw pillow. Like, make sure my 9-year-old bedroom is like Instagrammable and Airbnb ready. But it said, where words fail, music speaks. And I know it seems simple on its surface, but there is something about that. There is something to that where, and I'm sure with this Sweet Rain song that you put forward, and so many others, my older brother and I have been sending songs just back and forth to each other. It's like, this one hit me today. This one hit me today. And I think what we're meaning by that is, I don't have words for what I'm feeling right now. I'm trying to, like you sort of expressed, the discontinuity. It's not like what we perceive as anxiety is expressed as anxiety, or there's these little amorphous sort of knots within us that we have to work out and process. It's not like we can just put our finger on it and be like, well, like, right here in my left shoulder there is a knot of terror, and then in my right kneecap there's this like knot of anxiety or loss or something like that. And so I think music in some regards, and you tell me how you feel about this, but music is somehow like deciphering and sort of unlocking those different emotions so they can get out. And I've had so many moments where music has done that for me over the past couple of months. And like, I don't know, like, it's hard to find something else to liken that to. I don't know why music is that way, but I think it's awesome.
Well, part of it, I mean, it's because music is the only thing that we have in human experience that can light up the whole brain. Like brain imaging wise, of like, depending on how we use the music, it lights up different aspects of our brain. Like if we're actually playing music or singing or engaging, dancing with it, it's going to activate different parts of the brain. But because of the fact that like a lot of our ability to intellectualize and like form the words for things are a lot of like the frontal lobe and a lot of like the left hemisphere, which has a lot of like the language aspects. We need to use something that's a little bit more in other aspects of our body, or not body, brain. So, I mean, music, listening to it's very temporal lobe and maybe more into the right brain. And when I say left brain, right brain, it's very simplistic, and that's not really the case. I know some people say like, I'm more left brain than right brain.
I did
like,
read somewhere that was kind of
taking
debunked.
Taking it a little too simplistic when really we are, we're integrating both, but music has that ability to really work both sides of the brain. And so sometimes when we have lack of capacity in one area that normally is supposed to be helping us, like with certain things, like for example coming up with words, like that's more of our expressive language area, that when that's dysfunctioning, we can use music to be able to retrain or make new connections, to be able to relearn things too. And so that's what, and I'm also trained in a designation called neurologic music therapy. And that's working usually in neuro rehab for like those who've had TBIs, strokes, movement disorders, those who have a hard, but like basically any speech goals, motor goals, like being able to help rehabilitate things that have been lost, like functioning wise. But there's so many good like research and tidbits coming from that, of how, because music can access parts of our brains that maybe are tied to emotions, maybe are tied to more of like a deeper subcortical, like before we even get to thinking and kind of thinking about our thinking. It hits those areas that are more instinctual for us. Some people think of it, they call it the triune brain, just essentially saying the three parts, like a simplistic way of talking about three aspects of the brain. We have like the reptilian brain, which is more of our like deep area of
limbic system.
No, actually, it's more of like our brainstem, our cerebellum.
Gotcha.
That actually controls our like heart rate.
I'm just going to throw out like medical terminology, like asphyxiation.
Yes.
3rd degree burns.
But our brainstem, our spinal cord, and even like our cerebellum, all of that stuff.
That's lizard brain.
Lizard brain, yeah.
Lizard brain, yeah.
Because if you think way back to reptiles, like evolutionary aspects, like that's what they had. They had the ability to regulate their heart rate, feel hunger, feel thirst, like those basic instincts. But then as creatures evolve, we get mammals. We then have the limbic system, so the emotional center. So our behaviors are not only driven by like instinctual stuff, but now we have the ability to like feel anger, feel happy, feel sad, and maybe do behaviors based off of that, or anxious too. And
that's
then
the emotional. So we've got lizard brain, which is sort of like brainstem, sort of instinctual, like survive, reproduce, things like that. And then there's the limbic system, which is more emotional based, feeling in the moment.
And then you have the top part, which is more really just kind of like humans. We're the only ones that really have more of this aspect than others, and that's the cortex. That's where we're able to actually make rational decisions about things. So even though we're feeling hunger from our deep area, and we're also getting angry that we're hungry because of the emotional area, we may then be able to say, well, I'm not in a place to where there's no food around me. I have to wait a little bit and then I can get it. Or if we only had like the first two areas, we may act on that anger and like rob a convenience store. Like I don't have the money for it. That's like our cortex saying like I don't have the money for it, so I can't steal it. Very simplistic ways of thinking, but sometimes that's a way we can talk to people about, if they call it the hand brain too. Like you can use your hand to really talk about this 3 brain system of like flat hand. You have your more towards like your wrist is like the reptilian brain. If you fold your thumb in, that's the emotional system. And technically I would have to put 2 thumbs to make it left and right. But then once you close your 4 fingers over your thumb that's folded in, that is your cortex. And so sometimes even with people who get very stressed, or when we get stressed, we can literally flip our lid, which is bringing up our four fingers. And so then
like the cortex is
the
disengaged.
cortex, yeah. So we are no longer in that moment able to rationalize with ourselves. We are now speaking to our emotion brain and having to calm that down before we can finally get that cortex
back online,
be able to make rational decisions, which is why some people say, like, don't make rash decisions when you are in a state of emotion. Same thing can be said, like, with grief. Like, don't make very, like, big decisions in a state of grief, because it's emotions coming forward. Our ability to kind of think about our thinking or think about our emotions is not always fully there to go forward with.
Gotcha. And so music is one tool that's used in sort of getting that cortex back online. It sort of soothes the emotions so that cortex can come back online. Is that right?
It can be, yeah.
Okay.
It can be one of those things that immediately gets to the emotional center and is able to, I guess, in a sense, ground someone. Because one, music is a very auditory experience. We are now using our sense of hearing to ground ourselves in the moment. And depending on the song, like in your connection with the song, that can really kind of access certain memories, certain emotions, and depending on what you need in the moment. Like if you're already depressed and sad, and you listen to a song that is going to only exacerbate that depression and sadness, that's what we call musical cutting. Like you are now like intentionally digging yourself deeper with that music, and digging yourself deeper and not bringing yourself back up.
Okay.
Because I do want to say that, because sometimes we do listen to music that matches our emotions, and it actually does help us. Some people find that, like, listening to a song that they relate to emotion-wise and maybe helps them feel not alone with that emotion actually helps to start swinging them back in a different direction.
Yeah.
And so it's like knowing yourself. If by listening to this song and it hits on these emotions, afterwards, am I feeling better or am I feeling worse? Because then you need to start tailoring your music listening to bring yourself back up. So meet yourself where you're at, but take yourself to a desired state. Because I say meet yourself where you're at, because if you are in a state of like anger or sadness, putting on a happy-go-lucky song may not do that trick that you think it will, of like, oh yeah, I'm going to go from sad to happy because I listened to this upbeat song. Works for some people, because maybe there is a song that like instantly brings about that memory that is joyous for them. But like Pharrell's Happy, like putting that on when I'm depressed, like I'm going to get angry.
Yeah.
I'm going to be like, why?
This song is mocking me.
Like, why? How come they're happy and I'm not happy?
Right.
So it's like knowing yourself too. So yes, music, but also knowing yourself of, how can I access and almost help regulate my emotions with the music.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Actually, the episode before this one, my good friend Patrick and I talked a little bit about like darkness in music and the music industry, and one of the things that we came to sort of ties into what you just said. Like I went through a cleanup of my iTunes, jeez, what year is it? Spotify library recently, and took out a bunch of really negative music. And for the record, if I'm feeling like a knot on something, it really helps to like just go to my room, put my headphones on. I've got a specific set of songs that I listen to that I know will like get the waterworks going. And then usually once like I've listened to one or two of those, like, okay, cool, I'm good, gonna like, and I feel like I can move on after that. Versus to your point about like musical cutting, I feel like I had songs in my Spotify that were not even helping me like meet myself where I was. They were dragging and pointing in a downward direction. The example that I always give is like 9 Inch Nails. Like musically very compelling,
Yeah.
very interesting stuff. I love like the industrial sound.
Definitely.
It's like heavy guitars, overprocessed, computerized drums. It's the best of both worlds.
Mhm.
It's amazing. But lyrically, it's nihilistic. It's the world is meaningless. Nothing that I'm going through means anything. God either doesn't care about me or even like actively dislikes me and is punishing me for something. That's the narrative in those songs.
Yeah.
And I find that if I give that narrative a foothold, it is not good for my mental state overall. So tying into what you just shared.
Yeah. And I think for any listener, you know, listening to this too is that it's different for everyone. And like, it is needing to come to that realization for yourself of what does this music do for me? Because while you say that, it's like another person may actually feel hopeful after hearing
listening to a Nine Inch Nails song.
Because the fact that like
I want to meet that person.
Wow, that like they're thinking the same thing I'm thinking, and so I feel heard. And so like I feel not alone right now, and so now I can start to come back up from this state. And so another thing I'm very big on too is in the music therapy field, we're talking more about music-induced harm as a way to fight for licensure in every single state. Because right now we have a nationwide board certification. That's what I have. And not every state has like a state licensure like some of the other mental health professionals or professionals. And hopefully we'll get there, but I think the big thing that may help propel it is this research and discussion on music-induced harm to prove that like we need music therapists to know about all of this and can kind of think about all these factors in order to, you know, safely work with people using the tool of music. But I do also say, like, as a music therapist, that music is not my tool, it's actually the client's tool. And so, like, while other professionals can incorporate music, you know, within counseling and therapy, it's not music therapy what they're doing, because it has to be done by music therapists, but, like, they can use music to a certain extent, but they do have to recognize where, like, their knowledge stops and where, you know, ours start. And so, tangent to get back to music-induced harm is that we talk about how there's so many areas where the potential for harm could be. And sometimes people do it to themselves by listening to music. Like we talked about musical cutting. That's kind of an emotional form of harm that we might do to ourselves. Another one might be, especially for those who are dealing with substance use disorders or even addiction in general, is that maybe there's a song that you listen to or a type of music or artist that you listened to when you were using or when you were engaging in that addiction. And so by listening to it, we are now doing some physical harm for ourselves because now we're going towards that drug because it's creating these cravings in our body and our mind. It's also like a cognitive sense of harm because now you're ruminating on all of those urges and temptations to use your drug of choice. But another thing that I think is important too is that we get into this topic of cultural harm in a sense too, because when we talk about music that people view as problematic, sometimes people think about, you know, certain genres that may have cuss words in it and certain music that may talk about some triggering things. I have to have this conversation sometimes with my colleagues, and I had to do a presentation recently this week about music-induced harm because, you know, especially adolescents, they're listening to a lot of like hip hop, rap, and a lot of that's actually talking about things that they're actively going through. I'm working with traumatized individuals, and they're talking about like what happens in the streets or like seeing death and all that stuff, or you know, this is the music that they can relate to. And for me to tell them, we can't listen to that because it's explicit, or we can't listen to that because it's problematic. You know, if we say that to someone, this is music that they identify with. It's like, especially the adolescents, that's their identity formation's happening, and they may identify with that music as their life. And so now I'm telling them that they are problematic. And so that's just another thing that I kind of tie into, because when we talk about music and helping with emotions, I think sometimes people think that like it has to be happy-go-lucky music or a certain type of music that will help us, you know, cope with our emotions. But honestly, it depends on the person, and it actually, you may find that some people with quote unquote depressing music actually get hope from that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because like you said, if a song is able to meet somebody where they are, even if it's something that just appears to be very, very dark, like something like a Nine Inch Nails song or anything else of a similar darkness, I guess, intensity, uh, if it meets them where they are and makes them feel seen and heard and points them in an upward direction, that's a really good thing. So we've covered, this is like such a good conversation. We got to have you back like on the podcast at some point. This is so good. So we've covered a lot of ground here, and I'm gonna sort of summarize some of the tools that you recommended for folks who are processing grief or other trauma for that matter. Music, it's a really powerful tool for meeting yourself where you are, sort of unlocking those emotions. It is on the individual to sort of understand how to use that tool and like really maintain an awareness of, is this pushing me upwards or pushing me downwards? You also mentioned stories as a way for remembering the person, like sort of continuing to build that collage, and sort of as a consolation after they're gone, and sort of share and come together as a community. And then also the rituals of, like, I still think the one of you remembering your mom when there's a rainstorm.
Yeah.
I think that's a really beautiful one. Sort of setting a dedicated time to, okay, I'm going to remember this person in this time, whether that's by yourself or with family, creating that space and making it recurring so it's not something that just gets stuffed.
Yeah.
I think that's really beautiful. Are there any other tools, just in closing thoughts, any other tools or recommendations, thoughts that we haven't covered that you wanna share?
I just want to like reiterate the point that like the way that you grieve is the way that you grieve. And so, you may read about all these theories, all these models of grief, and the biggest one being the stages of grief. Like, take everything with a grain of salt, and to know that like there is no one set way to do things. There's no timeline to do things. That like if you are feeling like you're if you prescribe to just the stages of grief, then you feel like I can't move on to the next stage. It's like there's no set order for it. So I implore people to not feel like they're put in a box, or that there's a set way to do things, and to recognize that like there's so many ways of coping, that it's not like you're doing something wrong necessarily. I think another good way to put it is that there's another model of grief. It's called the dual process model. And essentially what they're saying is there's a couple different ways that we cope: emotion focused and what they call restoration focused. Emotion focused is kind of what we talked about, of you're focusing more on the emotions, you're allowing yourself to have the emotions, you're looking at things that remind you of them and all that stuff. That's helpful. But also what's helpful too is restoration oriented. So sometimes what that looks like is distraction.
Okay.
Maybe distracting yourself from feeling overwhelmed because you can't handle it in the moment. But sometimes it's also like picking up the pieces after a loss, like the other things that happen, like collateral damage, like for a spouse who loses a partner. It's like you're now having to take care of finances, or you're now having to maybe clean out their area. Like that stuff is also focusing on the loss, but it's in a different way. And some people feel like distracting from your emotions or doing investing yourself in those things is like a bad thing. But no, it's actually helping you move forward too. So kind of words of advice is to know that it's okay to do both sides of things. Focus on the emotions, do things that distract you, but also deal with the collateral damage of a loss. What to be wary of is if you're only doing one or the other, because you're going to overwhelm yourself with all the emotions if you're only doing emotion focused, and then you're also going to be practicing avoidance and never understanding your emotions if all you're doing is just distracting. So let it be this like flip-flopping experience for you of, if you're becoming too overwhelmed, you don't have to continue focusing on the emotions. You can do something to help kind of distract or lessen some of the emotions. Hopefully healthy.
Yeah. That's a really good framework. So distraction, something to sort of like, because the alternative to that is without distraction, it's just like you're in the emotion constantly and you're exhausted and can't do anything, versus distraction sort of gives you some time and space away from it to sort of process what's happened, recharge, so you can go back in.
Or even get your mind off of it. Like you start cleaning the house.
Yeah.
Because for you, that seems like a way to kind of clear your brain and clear your space. Like that's kind of a good distraction. And I mean, even some people, when their time is ready, like being able to go through the person's things and either put them in a box or put them away or give them away, or taking care of some of the extra duties that came afterwards, like dealing with the funeral, having to plan all of that. Like you weren't necessarily focused on emotions when you're planning logistics of a funeral, but that is still part of the process.
Gotcha. Sawyer, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thanks so much for talking with us, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for inviting me.